All right, we're going to get this started. Welcome, everybody, to the American Society of International Law's annual meeting. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this very special panel on Black women, global human rights, and policing. My name is Michelle Bratcher Goodwin. I am the host of On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin at Ms. Magazine and the executive producer of Ms. Studios. I am also a Chancellor's Professor at the University of California, Irvine, and a senior lecturer at Harvard Medical School. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to bring to you an outstanding panel that will take us through the diaspora in matters of human rights and the policing and surveillance of Black women. Joining me today to stitch together very important and overlooked threads are Karen Attiah. She is a columnist for the Washington Post, where she was previously the Post's founding global opinions editor. She's a devoted human rights advocate and a veritable international affairs expert, a former Fulbright awardee to Ghana, and a proud Ghanaian American based in Dallas, Texas. I'm also joined by Ana Paula Barreto, who is a proud Black Brazilian and longtime advocate for racial, gender, and reproductive justice, who is currently a Soros Equality Fellow and formerly a Senior Fellow at the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights for the People of African Descent Fellowship. She's also the director of the Transnational Birth Equity for Birth Equity Collaborative. I'm also joined by Asatou Sine. She is a dynamic feminist activist from Senegal who is devoted to fighting for women's equality and empowerment and against all forms of colonialism and racist oppression. She's also a very popular and successful fashion designer in Senegal and a former Yale Mandela Fellow for Northwestern University. And I'm also joined by India Thusi. She's a professor of law at the Indiana University Maurer School of Law and a senior scientist at the Kinsey Institute. She examines racial and sexual hierarchies related to policing, and she's the author of Policing Bodies, Law, Sex, Work, and Desire in Johannesburg. India is a prolific author, and she is currently a Fulbright global scholar. It is a pleasure for me to be with you all today, and I'm going to encourage you all to take yourselves off mute because we're going to have a conversation. And I first want to open the conversation by asking you, what brings you to the subject of policing and Black women? It's something that has been traditionally overlooked. As people think about policing, they know very well that it has a Black male face in the United States and globally, but most often concerns related to policing Black women happen to go ignored, even though, and if we're thinking about the United States, but I want this to be a global conversation, the United States incarcerates more women than any other country in the world. And disproportionately, they happen to be Black and brown women. But I want to know what brings you to the table in this discussion. I'm going to start with you, Karen, and then I'm going to go around.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and the opportunity to have this really important discussion with amazing women from around the world. I would say as a journalist and as a Black woman, I mean, it's how you described it very perfectly in your introduction. I think it was very much the fact that police brutality, violence, and who has the right to protection and who has the right to security and even who has the right to defend themselves was very much a male dominated face to it, male dominated voices around the situation. And so often the women show up in the media stories as the grieving mother, perhaps as the one expected to grant forgiveness, perhaps absolution for the killing of the Black man by police. And very rarely did I see these sort of outpouring of marches or concern or essays after essays for when Black women were facing, again, not just outright police brutality, but I think also cases where policing failed to protect Black women from the whims and whimsies of misogyny here in the US. So for me, I have always felt that my job as a journalist and my job as somebody who has a platform in these spaces is to uplift that. Again, I'm sitting here talking to you all from Dallas, Texas, and some may remember a few years ago the case of the Black teenage girl here in McKinney, Texas, who was seen on camera. She was at a pool party, and there was a video of
I remember that startling video, Karen. It was horrific.
Absolutely. And so again, I think that was one of my first pieces, just speaking about just how cruel this was. And yet, just a few weeks later, there was another video of a police officer dragging a Black teen across a classroom. And so these images were happening, and I just felt like, okay, I had to speak about it, had to call it out. So why I do this? I do this because I have to. Who else really will?
That's a really great point to transition on. And I want to come back to you after being with our other guests, because I also wonder what that's like for you as a journalist to get, a green light for the stories that are important to tell. Because some people may think that, well, and given your success, you may be able to write about anything that you want. But it also seems to me that there have been deep barriers in media in terms of being able to present the stories that relate to Black women's lives. India, I want to broaden this conversation to some of your work and this policing that encompasses Black women and Black girls, because also the story that Karen is telling too is a story about Black girls being policed, and not just Black women. It's bad enough that it's Black women, but also Black girls. But I also want to expand that to the geographies of the body and the policing of sex in the body. And your very important book, Policing Bodies, Law, Sex Work, and Desire in Johannesburg, broadens the conversation internationally and also relates it to the body. And can you unpack that a bit more for us, what that policing looks like?
Sure. Thank you for the introduction, Michelle and Karen. I really appreciate your remarks. I think what really brought me to this topic is that, I wondered to myself, what would it mean to bring intersectionality theory to criminal law theory, right? And to policing scholarship and policing work. Because what I observed was that when I was reading this work by notable policing scholars, almost entirely focused on male perspectives, male experiences. And it was almost as if there were no Black women in society, and Black women weren't especially impacted by policing and criminalization. And so I decided that was an area I want to focus on. And I did that research both in the United States, and I've done it in South Africa. And my book really focuses on what's been happening in South Africa. And, what I focused on was on the policing of sex work in particular, because I think sex work is interesting in terms of reflecting the different sexual hierarchies, both gender hierarchies, as well as racial hierarchies. And what I found is, depending on where you fit on the hierarchy, impacts the type of policing you receive. And so for those individuals who were whiter, who were lighter skinned, they were entitled to more protection from the police. Police saw them as benevolent, beneficiaries of their protection. Whereas the darker skinned people, the blacker skinned people, which has this particular meaning in South Africa, where there's a lot of xenophobia, or there has been this history of xenophobia, a history of colorism, a history of racism, Blacker people were entitled to less protection, were often left for neglect, and just seen as not worthy of police protection. And I think that provides interesting insights in terms of who do we deem as being valuable, who is, worthy of police protection, where you look at the same thing in the US, where, whiter women might be entitled to greater protection or seen as being more vulnerable, whereas, Blacker women might be left for neglect.
And we've seen those patterns worldwide, right? So as you talk about colorism and how this pans out in terms of complexion and the kind of alarmism related to complexion, sadly, that's been part of a diaspora story. And so, Isatu, I want to turn to you because this connection that India weaves for us in terms of sex work, we know one of the ways in which people, women, Black women, have been policed is with regard to their sexuality. And that traditionally, sometimes it's been that police target individuals based on their clothing. So I'm wondering, as a designer who's sort of coming into the space, what's your kind of thought process there? I mean, I recall the defense strategies of the 1980s, right? Well, gang rape, well, she was wearing red. I mean, it's unfathomable to think that people would actually put a defense like, well, of course, what else were we supposed to do? She was wearing red after all, right? Or, her skirt was above her knee. What else could be expected but that men would lose their minds? So, what do you bring to this when you're thinking about this through the lens as a designer and clothing people? How do these issues relate for you?
I mean, for me, I will start because I really can feel what Indy was saying. I have a personal experience of it. I was in St. Louis in 2016. I was with a group of friends and we were at a festival. So the festival was really white centric, even though we were in Senegal. And it was 3 a.m. I was walking. I was in a short. But because I was the only Black person, there was another Black man, but I was the only dark Black woman. I was picked up by the police. And when I answered to the police officer in Wolof, he told me the only reason I could be hanging there with white people is because I'm a prostitute. And for that, I was taken into custody. And when I was sharing it with a lot of Black women and mostly with a lot of dark-skinned women in Senegal, it was not unique. Most of us were just targeted on the street because the police officer felt that we must be prostitute dressing a certain way. And liberating people through fashion is something that I didn't even understand I was doing, because it was like, we're wearing African print, we're wearing short dress, we are changing things that are traditional, we are embracing our body, we're working on doing things and being free. And when you just realize that, oh, this is actually going to war against patriarchy, this is actually going to war against men. And the conversation is always around, oh, what was she wearing? What a woman is wearing, where she is, what she's eating, or where she was has nothing to do with the fact that she was assaulted. The only person responsible is the man. And I think in our society, we have made sure that we always find a way out for men. And when we go out and start to speak about those things, the outrage is always for men. But okay, you guys are trying to separate, you guys are doing this and this and that. And it's always, for me, very hard to talk about being a Black woman, being a feminist, and talking about my relationship with what is the police, because on a personal level, I have a very hard situation with them. On a professional level, I can go and use them to work on some issue. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit more later.
What you bring to mind is the question, and I wonder if on here, and I'm going to come to you, but just as a survey, I mean, how many of you have had a police encounter? And I know I have. I think we like all nods here, right? I mean, so look at that, right? 100% of us in this ASOL call have had the experience. And, I said to you, when you were mentioning being arrested, it reminded me of friends from Europe visiting me from Italy. And I was driving them, we were driving between states, and we had entered the state of Indiana. And I was taking them to the airport in Chicago. So we had a drive from the south, and being pulled over by an officer. And the officer, tapped on the window with his flashlight, looked in, and it was broad daylight. And the officer said, "What's the situation here?" Because my friends were Italian, white Italians. I was like, what was the situation, right? And clearly there was some suspicion. I said, "We're friends." And then the officer went around to the other side of the car to one of my friends to just confirm that we were friends. But, these kinds of issues that you experience or that I have experienced, and that's a mild experience compared to what you experience or what else I've experienced, are not the kinds of things that others have to go through. So, Anna, I want to turn to you as we sort of continue to circle the globe of our African diaspora. So often people may think about the questions that relate to race and policing and criminalization as being something that is either American centered, sort of people think about the Caribbean and Black people, or they might think about the continent, but they miss all of Central and South America. And so I want to know then what's that been like for you, filling in the blanks and being a real warrior and voice for lifting up and recognizing the African diaspora through your work in Brazil and elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. This is, well, I want to take a breath because this is a very difficult topic for me. So, I want to say that Brazil has the most violent police in the world, killing around 6,000 people every year. A lot of them are children. I also want to say that I am part of one of those communities that are highly criminalized and they are highly under the harassment and abuse of police every day. And what drove me to this work, and when I think about police brutality, and when we think about dignity, and as Karen mentioned, and who has the right, or who is being seen as a victim of, who has the right to even question something, or who have the right to even tell their own stories. Sometimes that is a questioning to a lot of our brothers and sisters in the diaspora, including like the favelas of Brazil, for example. And I want to share like a very short story that really drove me to the work of policing and thinking like policing and gender. In 2013, a woman, 40 years old, a woman called Cláudia Ferreira da Silva was dragged by a police car for many minutes. There is a video of it. And the morning in my office, I watch it, and we can see the other cars telling the police to stop. You're dragging her, but they don't stop. So they stop after several minutes, and they push her like if you were pushing like a piece of meat, right? Then the media refused to say her name. We the Black movement in Brazil has had to do a campaign for the local media to say her name, Cláudia. They will call her the dragged woman, in every news. And I also want to say that when we question the governor of Rio about this terrific, like it's not terrific the word. This sorry
Horrific.
for the word.
No, understood. Yes.
He said, well, it's not a crime because she was already dead. So we are fighting against so many levels of dehumanization. So we are fighting for not only to the level of understanding that this is a violence, unacceptable violence. We are fighting for folks to say our own names and not call us the dragged woman, the killed woman. We are fighting also for justice, because even the governor was diminishing the situation. So this is what we are fighting every day. And when we are thinking about what are the impacts in communities and children, then the conversation has to go much, much beyond that we are right now. And I would like to talk more about this in a moment.
Well, in fact, and we will unpack that. And what brings to mind are the challenges of understanding this. And so, India, I want to turn to you because it seems to me that something that stitches together all of the conversation that we've been having is something about historical origins. And I think that there is an origin story that is here, this kind of consistent, systemic dehumanization, devaluation of Black women and their lives. I mean, this isn't something that just was thought of yesterday, let's say, that the world came to a conclusion that Black women shouldn't be respected, that Black women should be policed and surveilled. This is a very long history. And so, India, given that we are in a milieu of rejection of history, I'd love for that to be surfaced a bit. So if you could just share a little bit about what that history represents, I'd appreciate that.
Sure. I think what's common with, a number of the countries that have been discussed is this history of settler colonialism, right? And, I think policing, has some of its origins from there. And, in this history of settler colonialism, part of the colonialist project is maintaining a racial and sexual hierarchy, right? That really, promotes and maintains white supremacy, but also maintains a certain sexual order in terms of, who's able to reproduce, whose bodies are going to be prioritized. And what the police do is reinforce this hierarchy. And I think we're going to speak a little bit, later about, abolition, like how do we respond to this? But I think it's really important to place policing within that history, to contextualize it in order to understand its legacy, right? Because when we put it in context, understand its legacy, see the work that it's doing now, it's really not that different from the work it was doing at its origins, right? Through the different types of policing, colonial policing, slave patrols and so forth, right? And really what it was doing is maintaining this hierarchy, maintaining, certain property interests. And, in this hierarchy, Black women have been often at the bottom, right? Their needs, their experiences have been at the bottom, whether as a result of, slavery and then their enslaved status, or just, colonialism and, maintaining the racial hierarchy attached to that.
It's fascinating that you say that. There's so many important aspects to what you just shared, right? So it reminds me that we're in the middle of a pandemic, and we see how there are essential care workers who've been treated in non-essential ways, as expendable and fungible. And you think about these histories of imperialism, settler colonialism, slavery, and the essential function of Black women's bodies coming in connection with that capitalism, and all manner of laws being erected around that, right? It is these laws that forbid the offspring of taking the status of their fathers, specifically instantiating sexual assault and rape as being part of a cultural narrative. The original policing being police slave patrol, right, to patrol all of what that represents, and so many other kinds of ways that become essential to global capitalism. And at the very heart of that is the dehumanization of Black women. Very recently, something has sort of come to my mind in terms of how do we translate, right? And I've wondered, what does a mother say the night before the slave auction to her child, right? Around the world, we have countries in Brazil and other places throughout the Caribbean, throughout the diaspora, that have never had to ask that question, right? How do you convey a message of humanity, even though you will never see your child again, because this system, which claims that it morally can do this, has designed laws around this, will snatch a child away from the mother the next morning. She'll never see that child. And in these very systems, these systems tell this woman and her child that they are nothing more than the status of property, that they are nothing different than a cow in the field or a pig in the field. And can you just imagine, I'm sure you can, just what that mother must amass in providing a message to that child to keep that child whole? And those are the kinds of questions that we don't have to study, but that we should, in all of these countries. So Karen, I want to get back to you, because there are media that are now, and in Philadelphia, there's a campaign now of media reflecting on their contributions to certain narratives, how media has been complicit in many ways of the kind of narratives and stories that we're telling, of not telling clear stories, or of refusing to tell the stories at all. So, I want to know, how do you navigate this? And do you see media as doing a better job with recognizing some of the harms that you and others have described on this webinar?
Yeah, but I have to I'm constantly cognizant of the fact that particularly the mass media has been a willing and complicit partner in crime to white supremacy and patriarchy in the United States and elsewhere. I think of, and to a certain extent to India's point, thinking about, how we just now talked about, slave patrols of the past and settler colonization, you know, the past. And again, as I join you guys here from Texas, looking at, part of my job is I think, to look at the laws that are being passed now and seeing that not much has changed. And I think my job, particularly as an opinion columnist, is to direct the reader to situate what's happening now in just another node of the same poisoned seed, right? So let's take the Texas law that effectively bans abortions for women here in this state. It predominantly will affect poor women, Black women, brown women. It effectively basically is this return to vigilantism, really surveillance, public citizen surveillance of whether or not a woman wants to exercise sovereignty over her own body, which I think is the fundamental human right that has been denied to Black women across the diaspora.
Historically, right?
Historically.
Yeah.
Right. So to me, to just frame this as, oh, this is a Democrat versus Republican culture war sort of thing, and less so as a perpetuation of the caste, the racial and gender caste system in this country. I think my sort of sometimes very lonely job is to frame things in that way. And it's a very, again, it's still a very violent type of system. And I think, again, another just example, maybe on something that I've written, I just think of in this country in particular, when it comes to gun violence, for instance, and the face of gun violence and its victims. I mean, we had here just 2 years ago, the rapper Megan Thee Stallion, who was shot by one of her another male rapper, shot in the foot, and spoke about how she had to limp out bleeding and how comments were blaming her for what happened. And it was just insane to me that if somebody with the level of fame and money and what we think of as privileges can't escape the fact that she's a Black woman and still wasn't deserving of coverage. The comments on my face when I wrote that were just disheartening, and blaming Black culture in general for this sort of violence, blaming her. And so I looked at that, I'm like, how much harder will it be for someone without her resources, someone without her name recognition to get this sort of protection? And so it's also when we do go missing, when we do end up becoming victims of domestic violence. The reports I'm thinking of the recent story of Lauren Smith Fields, the Black woman who went out on a Bumble date and was found dead. And the police in the investigation, it turns out they didn't even have the courtesy to notify her family that this had happened. They let the man she went out on a date with just walk away. And I think there were some reports saying that, like, oh, he didn't seem, as a white man, he didn't seem like he was of interest. So it's these sort of stories that happen that bubble up to the level of national attention. I think there is almost like a social media campaign to get Bumble to do something and to shame even the police department to do something. But I think when it comes to a media perspective, there is part of it is, how do I put it? It's a deeper systemic issue of covering Black women in general as human beings, even before it gets to the point of death and violence and discrimination, which we have still a problem with.
To your point on the historical arc, right now, people could go on Google and they could search advertisements across, and they'll see images where papers hundreds of years ago would be complicit in ads on runaway slave and so forth, right? I mean, so there are lots of different ways in which we can see commissions and omissions over time, and they are startling in present day just how much work there has to be to get the same kind of attention to the kinds of harms that Black women experience. And as you were mentioning abortion rights, I think that that's a really good segue for us to think about in terms of just reproductive liberty and independence, right? On this call, I would probably guess that almost everybody on this call, when you thought about or heard about the Texas law SB 8 that bans abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy, making no exceptions for rape or incest, and that provides for individuals being able to spy on and sue people who aid and abet in the termination of pregnancy. Right away, I thought about, oh, fugitive slave act, right? Like, what's old is new again. And it's very interesting how so many people needed time to get to that. And yet we're talking about populations in Texas that will be affected just like, hundreds of years ago, Black women affected if they want to run to freedom. Same in these instances, Black women wanting to get to reproductive liberty that is already guaranteed by the Supreme Court, being tracked and being surveilled, or the people in their lives being tracked and surveilled. And so, Asaitu, I want to turn to you on this question, and then to you, Anna, about what these concerns mean just in terms of autonomy of the body, right? And how this kind of policing that we've seen all around the world affects women's liberty, autonomy, and privacy with regard to their very bodies. And Asaitu, I'll start with you.
I think when we, I feel like, and I know as a Black person who is in America right now, even if I'm not African American, I know that there's no privilege on that, but as an African person, you are privileged being, like, I'm in the state of California right now, being in the state where abortion is legal, or you can have it by phone or go to the clinic. In Senegal, just to talk about how violent the law is, if you are an unmarried woman and you have a miscarriage, you can end up in jail, because if you go and the doctor check, oh, something is happening, they are saying that you caused it. And the only reason they're saying you caused it is because you're not married. So there's nothing, no incest, it doesn't matter if you are trigger warning a 12 years old who is raped. It doesn't matter if you are a 9 years old. It doesn't matter if it is incest. Abortion is illegal. We have been working very hard recently to have it at least legal for incest, for underage, but it's not happening. But on the same time, you have women who can't afford it when they know the right man in the country. And so it's like who has what, and who has money to actually access it, and who knows who. And every time you just like face this discrimination on that level. Like for somebody who is dark skinned like me, I am not going to be able to afford or to be able to know the people who can give me abortion in Senegal. For somebody who is light skinned, it might be easier that even if you get the abortion and people find out, your skin color can, make sure that you get out of that situation. It's very complicated to actually own our body in anything, because everything that we do, the society, the Senegalese, and also the background as Muslim women, always tell us, oh, you did wrong. The wrong is always on the woman. The wrong is always of what you were wearing. The wrong is always of who you were with. You are the person responsible for whatever has been happening to you or whatever is done with you. I don't think abortion law is something that we're going to have anytime soon in Senegal. And I feel like when I was listening and I heard the Texas law in the US, I was like, whoa, you guys are really, really going back, because for us, we're actually trying to have the conversation, knowing that it's might not happen for the next 100 years, but for a country that has it, and then a state that has it, and then decide to take it back, it's really scary. Whatever is happening in America when it comes to policing Black bodies is scary, really scary. And it's like taking us back to, places you guys call, the third world. And you're having more harder laws than some of these countries that we are in. And it's just, it's interesting and very sad to watch on a Black woman's perspective and a feminist perspective.
Well, I think that one also can see these as the dissolution, the fragmenting of a democracy, right? Key to democracy is the ability to be able to have liberty in one's own self and being. I mean, if you think about the US Constitution itself, it bothers to protect one's safety in one's home, one privacy. How can your home have even more of a constitutional stand than you have in your own body vis-a-vis the state? Anna, these
I,
issues, oh, go right ahead, Isatu.
yeah, it would be, I just wanted to add something. And when we talking about in Senegal, most of the women who are actually in jail are in jail for abortion or because they have killed their babies. Because there is a really high stigma over having babies outside of marriage also. So like these laws, even though they're really put in place to put women in boxes and make sure that they have no freedom. They have no will on their own whatsoever.
And Isatu, what you're expressing as well is how central freedom of the body happens to be to freedom of liberty, right? It's sort of at the key of democracy, at the key of a government's legitimacy and rule of law is the ability to be able to govern, one's body as a woman. And you can see a fracturing of society when that simply doesn't happen. Well, there are any number of things that have come up already in this conversation. With Karen and also us too, I couldn't help but think about how so many of these questions, they root in white supremacy and histories of colonialism and slavery, but they also have their own meaning within Blackness as well, right? And so that we know that sexual assault and sexual violence can occur within a Black community, and that too often goes ignored. Karen, you mentioned Megan Thee Stallion, and I couldn't help but think about Rihanna and Chris Brown. I was stunned that Chris Brown was still receiving awards after the world saw what he did to Rihanna and still being honored by Black organizations after that. It was absolutely stunning to me. And so, Anna, and I saw that you just unmuted for a second there, Karen. I'm going to turn to Anna and then we can come back to that because I'm still thinking about that. Bill Cosby, too. And so, Anna, maybe you want to actually start us off with that about the kind of violence that may be difficult to escape or to bring attention to because it comes from within Black communities.
Yeah, that's a difficult topic. I think about same thing in Brazil when the victim is a woman or a child. I think that is even more complicated when it is a child. Like the Rio police, there is a report saying that the Rio police killed around 300 children for the past 6 years in Rio only. I think if you know a little bit about Rio, there is a lot of violence. It's really almost like a civil war, I would call. And when the victim is not a male, that is less organizing around the case, that is more difficulty to say the names. I also want to add, just connecting to abortion, that it's important for us to reflect about how well organizing is the anti-right movements globally and how they operate the same way in each country that they go. And how this is
like the
absolutely,
same playbook,
absolutely,
country by country.
Yes, and it's also important also to recognize that the money comes from the U.S. So they are very well organized. They go to Latin America, to Africa, to Asia, but the funders are basically like churches in the U.S. And we start to see like the push for conservative laws in many other countries because there is a winning here that folks see that they can replicate in other countries. And I think it's important for us to also understand that the movements or the anti-right movements we fight against, we are fighting against the same movements globally. And we also need to further understand how they work well connected. And just to finalize my part, I want to say that when we are talking about abortion, it's very important to talk about class. I think as was mentioned here, In Brazil, also, we have what we call the three causales, which is like abortion is legal under the three circumstances of incest, rape, and when there is a risk of life for the mother. However, we all know that if you have money, you can do whatever you want in any country in the world. You can travel to another city. In Brazil, it's very common. You just go to a very fancy hospital and they will attend you and say there was a small surgery that happens. So we know that class is a main factor here. And I also want to say that's how we also need to connect with class, because when we are thinking about capitalist society, resources are fundamental for when we're thinking about like the quality of life and dignity for many people.
And you know what? I really appreciate that you've raised that, the importance of class and what it's meant to discussions about reproductive health rights and safety. And then also there's LGBTQ status as well, because one sees also through colonialism and the imposition of laws that didn't previously exist that were very homophobic. And these legacies continue to exist in countries where there's been this, settler colonialism in parts of Africa and elsewhere. There's a lot that I think is important about this conversation, a lot that's been raised that's deeply troubling, including the criminalization of reproductive liberties, including, as you said, Anna, the U.S. exporting, right, these legacies through the Helms Amendment and what that was understood to mean, right? If we understand that having reproductive autonomy for women, access to birth control, access to being able to terminate a pregnancy, all of these things translate to being able to complete an education, to attend college, to be able to get the work that one wants. And if you think about a country playing a very heavy hand in squashing that, what then must that mean for the liberation of Black and brown women all around the world, and the purposeful, perhaps, of closing that down? Karen, I wanted to turn back to you.
Yeah, actually, after Anna just spoke, I just thought she brings up a really good point about the mobilization of the right and how this is affecting things globally. And this is something that I struggle with, and I'd be curious to see what my other panelists think about this. And I was reading an article the other day that sort of encapsulated the so-called culture wars. And it had this line that still sticks with me. The right, or the right wing, mobilizes while the left tries to persuade. And I would kind of take that a little bit further in terms of just the willingness of the right to pour almost endless resources, massive organization into implementing their agenda that is taking us all backwards. And again, I don't want to make this into just a sort of a right-left type of political divide, but it is disheartening when I think of, let's take like the Breonna Taylor case, right? And it just seems like when it comes to Black women's trauma and the violence that we face both within our communities and from white supremacy, it's like we get hashtags, we get hashtag Black, believe Black women, we get this sort of performative response very often that is no match from the perilous policy and real world attacks coming from the other side. And so there is, for me at least, a growing sense of from whence is our hope, from where is the actual help to come? And we hear a lot again from liberals, and saying that we just need to persuade, and I see this in the media as well. We need to persuade,
right?
Well, yeah,
that's the point that you're making, and I want to bring India onto this as well, because it's a really great point that you make, and bringing in Breonna Taylor, right? So when you think about it, Breonna died before George Floyd. She was gunned down in the middle of the night. I mean, she is an essential care worker during the time of a pandemic, and one would think that had it not been for the public lynching that we saw of George Floyd dying under the knee of a Minneapolis police officer, would people even know about Breonna Taylor, whose death had been weeks before. I think that you make such an important point there. So, India, one of the things that you mentioned is that, we would get to this point about abolition. Um, and abolition doesn't necessarily resolve the issue of Breonna Taylor, who was gunned down in the middle of the night on a no-knock warrant, and it's just such a brutal and horrific way. But what are the turning points? I mean, how do we sort of reimagine, rethink policing? Some people say, well, we need more women in police forces. Some people say that what it is that we need is to defund the police. Some people say, well, we just simply need to abolish the police. But I think, if anything, what we've seen from the conversation here is that we have a global kind of problem that isn't just one thread, but many different threads that historically have impacted the lives of Black women in ways that are quite nefarious.
Yes, speaking about the legacy of policing, knowing that it's been rooted in, white supremacy and maintaining, what you were alluding to earlier, Michelle, like racial capitalism, right? This really unequal society that we live in these different countries. I think it kind of points to the fact that trying to reform policing, I think, is futile. There have been attempts to reform it since it was initiated that have not worked. And I think we're at a point where we really need to think about what type of society do we want? What type of society can we build that we can focus on preventing harm, right? And not also introducing the harm that comes with state-sanctioned violence. And, I think a lot of, when speaking about abolition, I think a lot of times people get caught up on, what do we do if we have someone that's dangerous in our community? How do we deal with these dangerous few? But what gets lost in the conversation is, how do we deal with the pleasure and joys of the many? What about everyone, right? How do we support everyone's material needs? How do we create a society where we can prevent harm and respond to it in such a way where we can still hold people accountable without relying on just police and cages, right? There are ways to hold people accountable, and there are communities that are doing this type of work. There are ways that people are engaging in abolitionist projects that are real and that are showing, good results. And I think kind of focusing on that positive aspect of abolition is really important, in terms of, whether we can diversify our way into like human rights policing or more just policing. I don't think that's possible. If you look at the context of South Africa, where, after apartheid, there was this effort to transform the police, make it a more diverse police force. They changed their name from South African Police to South African Police Service to indicate that they would serve the community, serve the people. But, you still have racist policing in South Africa with Black people enforcing that racist policing. Even when I did research with police officers in South Africa, they expressed to me nostalgia about apartheid, which I found shocking, right? But there was other research that reinforced that in terms of, human rights placing a limits on their power as police officers. And so what that kind of speaks to is it's just a very function of policing using violence to, protect certain property interests, protect certain hierarchies, is going to create these situations that encourage, violations of our, autonomy, our basic rights. And so I don't think there's a way to diversify policing. And, I just wanted to comment on some of what's been said earlier. One thing that I've kind of been thinking about throughout this conversation is the Sojourner Truth poem, Ain't I Woman, right? And I feel it just rings true so much in terms of,
it so does, right?
Black women be recognized as being, also a woman, right? When can you also be worthy of protection? When can your humanity be recognized? We have this idea of who the ideal victim is, right, in society. So even when you look in the context of like human trafficking, it was interesting. I did this research. When you used to do a Google search for human trafficking victim, all you would find was white women, white girls, and then you find Black men or Black shadowy figures or foreign figures behind them. The first several pages of that, which was interesting, right? And I wrote about it. I think they've kind of corrected the algorithm a little bit, but like, that really speaks to, what we conceptualize when we think of a victim.
Well,
we mentioned
India, when you think about the original trafficked and kidnapped people, right? Like the definition of kidnap should actually have slave ships, right? Sex
Exactly.
trafficking, human trafficking, right?
Exactly. And that's why you can have situations where when a Black woman is a victim, it just gets ignored, right? Even another example with R. Kelly, right? The fact that he was, he engaged in his conduct against so many people, and he was doing it for so long. I'm a geriatric millennial. When I was a first year in college, at the time I was like 17 or something, I remember this comedian came and said, "Oh, all of you guys are too old for R. Kelly. It's a good thing he's not around here," right? Kind of suggesting, the fact that even at 17 or 18, we were too old for what R. Kelly was looking for. But what's really problematic about it shows just how widespread and acknowledged the fact that he was engaging in this conduct, the fact that he was this predator, and it was just tolerated for so long.
Yeah, I think, India, what makes this conversation so important with you all, and I just want to celebrate you all as we begin that process of wrapping up our webinar today, because what's been made really clear is that it has been an open secret. It's not a secret at all, but it's right in front of us, the ways in which Black women have been denigrated over time, systemically, institutionally, and how there's been very little effort to resolve that, to reckon with it at all. And these histories stare us in the face, and then they reify over and over again. You mentioned R. Kelly, and there are a bunch of different names that have been floated through this conversation. So my final question to each of you, keeping in mind the time, it's gone by really quickly, is what comes next? So I want to hear about what you're thinking about, what's keeping you up at night, and what you're trying to do to bring attention to the kinds of issues that we're talking about today. And I'll also say to our audience, make sure that you look at the chat, because the chat has, inside the chat, have been placed links to their articles, their work, and many of the reference points that have been made by our guests today. So, Asaitu, I want to start with you. What's coming next for you? Where are you taking your activism given today's conversation and what you were doing before today's conversation?
I want to touch a little bit about abolitionism, because for me, before just wrapping up, I think it's very interesting, like what India was saying. She's talking in a South African perspective, which is black and white, and also in the American perspective, which is also black and white. As somebody who has been put in custody in Senegal for many time, and which one was a man who say, "Oh, there is too many Senegalese women, we need to kill them." And I put a complaint against him. He was arrested, and the police put me in custody for 10 hours, trying to make sure if I didn't have a personal vendetta with him. I understand when people say we need to change policing. But then as a feminist who work directly with victims of sexual assault, mothers who have lost their children, who works with kids that have been abused, I have seen relief in those people seeing their predator going to jail. Yes, I understand that a lot of people say these are cages, human beings shouldn't be there. But I'm not saying I need people who are abolitionists to tell me what is replacing police today, but I want to hear more about what are we going to do because this behavior are not going to change overnight. Our Black families, our Black neighborhood, our people around us who rape, abuse, beat, they're not just going to change because the police doesn't exist anymore. So what are we going to replace the police with? Yes, the police is very bad. It's very bad in America. It's very bad around the world. But for me, there is a little bit of relief for putting some people who deserve to be in jail in jail.
That's part two. So as we are wrapping up today, I appreciate you mentioning that. And I think it further exposes the complexities of the kinds of conversations that we're having. And I don't think that these are mutually exclusive, what India and what Asaitu are coming to. All right, in our final few minutes, what's next? Karen, I'm going to turn to you, and then Anna will close out with you, India.
What's next is to, I think, keep having conversations like this. I think for me, as a journalist and a columnist, it's super helpful to be connected to, people like India, Anna, to help remind me and those that I work with in the media that of the broader implications of a lot of these questions. So I think that community building, resource sharing, idea sharing is part of, and I've been thinking a lot about this lately, is part of, frankly, the global culture work we need to do. A lot of this is rooted in thousands of years of culture, religion, patriarchy. But I think increasingly about what does it take to change culture. So that is kind of what I'm hoping to do a bit more of my work in, I think.
That's actually a very, very important question because culture can be so very difficult to change. And at the heart of this conversation and so many other aspects of the arc towards justice relates to culture. Anna, what comes next with the work that you are doing?
Thank you so much. I want to say one phrase that this amazing Brazilian thinker always says: between the right and the left, I am Black. And I think that for us as Black people, sometimes the conversation between left and right, I think we need to be careful with that, historically speaking. Now, I'm organizing a couple of different events and projects around police brutality and women. We're going to have an event with the Human Rights Council next month on the impacts of police brutality on children. So you are all invited to attend. I'm also doing a lot of work with the new UN mechanism on police brutality. They just chose the experts. Now we're going to have the first couple of sessions. I will be doing work with them as well. And at the end of the year, we're going to have our film festival on reproductive justice and Black women in the diaspora.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Anna. And we'll be sure to make sure that folks know about this important work that you're doing. All right, India, what's next in terms of your work in this domain?
I'm just going to keep on researching, writing, being in community, addressing some of the questions that Satu raised, right? Like, how do we hold people accountable? How do we recognize the harm that people have suffered, especially, when we're speaking about sexual violence? I think some of the work that Miriam Kaba has done can be instructive in terms of, transformative justice, what alternative models might look like. But I think, what I want to kind of turn to is not just focusing on what needs to be removed, like removing the criminal system or removing policing or criminalization, but focusing more on what does that positive project look like? What are the structures that need to be built? How do people need to be supported? And just kind of focus my mind on that over the next, I guess, few years.
Well, thank you very much for that, India, Karen, Anna, and Asatu. I very much appreciate you joining us today. And thank you to my colleagues at the American Society for International Law for making sure that there was space devoted to Black women, global human rights, and policing. This only scratches the surface. There's a need for greater engagement on all of the kinds of issues that we discussed today. And I look forward to being a part of that with ASIL and also with these amazing women who joined me today. Thank you all so much. And I look forward to the next time.